Hello, my friends. I hope this moment finds you safe and warm, with a quiet room around you and a cup of something comforting in your hands. Tell me, have you ever stayed silent about the truth because you were afraid of what it might cost you? Tonight, we return to a forgotten river house in a small mountain town, a place where dust hides secrets, and a woman's name was buried under 50 years of shame. A quiet veteran is sent there for a simple job. He expects nothing more than empty rooms and creaking floors. But his old German shepherd sensed what human hearts had learned to ignore. Before we step into this river of memory together, ask yourself gently, if the truth knocked on your door tonight, would you have the courage to open it? The first cold of November settled gently over Cedar Hollow, leaving a thin veil of frost on the grass and a pale stillness in the mountain air. By the time the sun reached the narrow main street, a man in a red and black plaid jacket was already at work. Daniel Harris locked the side door of an empty storefront and slipped the key back into his pocket. At 59, he moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that wasted motion cost more than time. He wasn't tall, but his shoulders were still broad beneath the thick flannel, shaped by years of lifting, running, carrying. First as a rescuer in uniform, later as a man who fixed what other people left behind. His hair was cut short and mostly gray now, with heavier silver at the temples. The lines in his face had settled deep, especially around his eyes, which were kind but tired in a way that sleep alone never seemed to fix. At his side walked Duke. The German shepherd stayed so close that their shadows merged on the concrete. Duke's coat was dark and thick, his movements steady and deliberate. A faint scar curved along his flank, barely visible beneath the fur. Another pinched softly near the edge of one ear. His eyes were alert but gentle, tracking Daniel more than the street, as if the rest of the world was only background noise to the man he followed. Cedar Hollow was waking slowly. A pickup truck rolled past with a lazy wave from the driver. The small bakery on the corner glowed warm through its fogged windows, the smell of sugar and coffee drifting into the cold. Daniel nodded to a few familiar faces, returning greetings with brief, polite gestures. He was known here, not as a hero, not as anything special, just as the man who checked on places when others were gone, who fixed broken latches, replaced loose boards, and didn't ask too many questions. His work had started as a favor and turned into a rhythm. 5 years earlier, Daniel had arrived in Cedar Hollow with only what fit in the back of his truck and memories that refused to stay buried. A fellow veteran had once mentioned the town, spoken about it like a place where nothing much happened and nobody expected anything extraordinary. That had sounded like safety to Daniel. At first he walked just to move his body, to quiet his mind. Then people began stopping him. Could he look at a cabin while they were gone for the winter? Could he fix a door that wouldn't quite close? Could he check on an old storage shed before the snow came? Over time, it became his life. By mid-morning, Daniel had finished checking a small ridge cabin owned by a retired school teacher. He tested the locks, checked the pipes for leaks, scribbled a short note on the kitchen counter. All secure. We'll check again after the next cold front. Duke followed him from room to room with silent focus, his nose tracing old scents, his tail relaxed. As they drove downhill, the mountains opened just enough to reveal the river below, gray and insistent, sliding through stone like it had for generations. Duke lifted his head toward the open window, ears flicking at distant sounds Daniel could not hear. For a moment, the man tightened his grip on the wheel without realizing it. "Easy, buddy," he murmured. "Not every noise is trouble." The words echoed inside him in a way he didn't quite like. There had been a time when Daniel could not afford to be wrong about danger. A road in dust and heat. A moment's hesitation, the sound of everything changing all at once. He forced the memory back down and tapped the military watch on his left wrist, anchoring himself in the present. Cedar Hollow, November. Quiet. By the time he reached his small rental house, the light had shifted. Duke drank from his bowl while Daniel rinsed his thermos and switched to heavier gloves. He checked the toolbox out of habit: flashlight, batteries, plastic sheeting, tape. It was more than he usually needed. But Daniel had long ago learned that preparation was its own kind of comfort. His phone vibrated in his jacket pocket. The name on the screen was unfamiliar. "This is Harris," he said after answering. The voice on the other end was calm and professional, belonging to a woman who sounded somewhere in her late 40s. She introduced herself as Brenda Cole from Cedar Hollow Savings and Loan, the town's only remaining bank. Daniel pictured the old building instantly. The faded brass fixtures, the peppermint bowl on the counter, the way time seemed to pool there instead of passing. "We've worked with you before," Brenda said. "You checked the Fulton cabin last winter." "Yes, ma'am." "We have a property that needs a look today, if you're available. The owner passed earlier this year. It's been sitting empty, and with the river rising this season, well, we'd like to be cautious." Daniel leaned lightly against the kitchen counter. "Which property?" There was a fraction of a pause before she answered. "The Moore House, down by the bend." The name stirred a vague unease. He had heard it before, spoken softly at the diner, mixed with glances that ended conversations instead of inviting them. "Clara Moore," Brenda added. "There are still legal matters attached to the estate. But for now, we just need to be sure the home is secure." "I can go this afternoon," he said after a moment. "Thank you, Mr. Harris. The key will be at the front desk." When the call ended, Daniel stood quietly for several seconds, his hand resting on the edge of the counter. Duke came to him and nudged his leg once with his nose. "Yeah," Daniel said softly. "We're going somewhere new." The road down to the river curved away from town, narrowing as the trees thickened. The air grew damper, colder. The cannery appeared first, an abandoned brick building crouched beside the water like a forgotten animal. Across from it, half hidden by bare trees and untrimmed brush, stood the Moore House. Daniel parked at the bottom of the dirt drive and stepped out. Duke leapt down lightly and shook the frost from his fur. The house was 2 stories, white paint peeling in wide flakes, the front porch sagging slightly at the center. The windows were dark, reflecting only the gray sky and the slow movement of the river. It was quiet in a way that felt deliberate. Daniel stood for a moment at the edge of the driveway, the old key heavy in his pocket. He tried to imagine the woman who had lived here. Clara Moore. A name that had carried a low, uneasy weight in Cedar Hollow for as long as Daniel could remember. People said she had taken money after the flood many years ago, that she had stolen from people who had lost everything, that she had chosen to live alone because she could not bear the town's judgment, or because the town could not bear hers. The truth, Daniel suspected, was tangled somewhere between those versions. He stepped onto the narrow path leading up to the porch. Duke moved ahead of him, his body lowering slightly, his ears straight and forward. Halfway up the steps, the dog stopped. Duke sniffed the bottom railing, then the door frame. A low sound formed in his chest. Not quite a growl, not quite a warning, but something between. His posture shifted from easy confidence to alert stillness. Daniel froze. For a long moment, none of them moved. The man, the dog, the quiet house, the river sliding steadily behind it all. "That's all right," Daniel said gently, resting his hand on the worn wood of the porch rail. "I feel it too." The house remained silent, but the space between the door and the waiting key felt heavy, as if something unseen had finally noticed that someone had come. And for the first time all day, Daniel wondered whether this small job might be more than just another quiet favor. Daniel did not open the door right away. He stood on the porch, with one hand resting on the worn wooden railing, feeling the faint tremor of Duke's tension travel up through his own body. The river moved behind the house with a steady, almost patient sound, and the closed door before him looked no different from any other, just paint, hinges, shadow. Yet the air around it felt dense, as if it had been holding its breath for years. "Easy," Daniel murmured, not quite sure whether the word was meant for the dog or for himself. He drew the key from his pocket at last and slid it into the lock. The metal resisted for half a second before giving way with a slow, reluctant click that seemed too loud in the quiet. When he pushed the door open, a thin, cold breath of air slipped out to meet them, carrying the scent of old wood, cold water, and something faintly herbal that might once have been soap or medicine. Dust lifted in pale clouds, slow enough to catch the light, then settled again as if uncertain where it belonged. Duke went in first. His body shifted into a working stillness that Daniel recognized instantly. Head lowered, nose close to the floor, every step measured. The dog moved without sound across the narrow front room, while Daniel followed more cautiously, allowing his eyes to adjust. The space was modest and dim, crowded more by stillness than by furniture. A small table stood near the wall, with one chair tucked neatly beneath it and another left slightly crooked, as though someone had once pushed it back and never returned to straighten it. Shelves lined the far side, their paint chipped and dulled with age, holding stacks of folded cloth and the spines of old books whose titles had faded into anonymity. The floor creaked under Daniel's weight, not with threat, only with the tired, familiar protest of wood that had learned to bend instead of break. He moved slowly, checking corners, door frames, shadows, the habits of caution rising in him without effort. Duke passed through the living area and stopped. Daniel rounded the corner and saw why. On the far wall hung a single framed photograph, its glass filmed with dust. Duke sat before it, ears tipped forward, gaze locked with quiet intensity. Daniel stepped closer and brushed the glass with his sleeve. The image beneath came into focus. A young woman stood at the center, dark hair loosely gathered back, her mouth caught between a smile and something gentler, almost unsure. 4 children pressed close around her, 2 boys and 2 girls, all grinning without reserve. One of the smaller children clung to her hand, fingers wrapped with fierce trust. Clara Moore. For a long moment, Daniel simply looked at her face. This was not the woman Cedar Hollow had taught him to imagine. There was warmth here, and a guarded kind of hope. Duke shifted slightly and leaned his shoulder against Daniel's leg. A quiet, grounding weight. Daniel reached out and straightened the crooked frame by a fraction of an inch, as if the smallest order might honor the life that had once filled the room. The rest of the house revealed itself without resistance. The narrow kitchen smelled faintly of cold metal and dried herbs. A kettle ring still marked one burner on the stove. Mismatched plates sat neatly in the cupboard, their edges worn thin by years of use. Upstairs, reached by a steep staircase that groaned softly underfoot, were 2 small bedrooms. One held a narrow bed with a faded quilt smoothed with deliberate care. The other was nearly bare, a wooden chair beneath the window, an empty dresser facing the wall. Daniel tested the windows for looseness, ran water briefly through the taps, listened for the telltale echo of frozen pipes. Everything, for now, seemed stable. The house did not feel abandoned so much as paused, caught between what had been and whatever waited beyond it. When they stepped back outside, afternoon had begun to sink toward evening. Daniel locked the door again with the same slow care and turned away with a faint, unexpected reluctance. Halfway down the path, Duke looked back once more at the closed entry, ears flicking as if memorizing a sound only he could hear. At the road below, a woman stood beside a small grocery bag propped against a mailbox. She was compact and sturdy, her silver hair trimmed short beneath a knit cap, her posture upright with the quiet authority of someone used to being both seen and relied upon. She studied Daniel with frank curiosity. "You must be the fellow from the bank," she said. Her voice was brisk, practical. "Or one of the ones who like to wander into places best left alone." "Just checking the property," Daniel replied evenly. "Daniel Harris." She gave a small nod. "Nora Green. I run the grocery on Pine Street, or what's left of it." As she spoke, another woman appeared from behind the low hedge carrying a tray of empty pie tins. Taller and broader at the shoulders, with warm brown eyes and curls escaping loosely from a clip, she set the tray down and laughed easily as Duke trotted to greet her. "You always scare people off before I get a look at them," she teased Nora, then knelt to rub Duke's neck. "Evelyn Parker. I keep the diner alive with caffeine and stubbornness." Duke accepted the attention with dignified approval, tail thumping lightly against the dirt. Nora's gaze slipped back to the house. "Everything still standing?" Daniel answered carefully. "For now." Evelyn leaned on the mailbox. "That place stood longer than most folks thought it would." Nora hesitated, then sighed. "Clara kept it tighter than people gave her credit for. Didn't trust many, though." Daniel glanced between them. People in town seemed to have strong opinions about her. The two women exchanged a look, years of shared knowing passing between them in a second. "After the flood," Nora said finally, "money went missing. Relief funds. Folks were desperate. When nothing added up, someone had to take the fall." "And Clara was quiet," Evelyn added softly. "Quiet enough to make stories grow around her instead of from her." Nora adjusted the grocery bag in her arms. She fixed roofs when no one watched, left food on porches without a name. But kindness doesn't travel as fast as blame. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. Why didn't anyone say so? "Because saying so costs," Evelyn replied gently. "And most people don't like the bill." The river stirred behind the house, steady and indifferent. Duke lifted his head toward the sound, ears shifting. "You heading back into town?" Nora asked. Daniel nodded. "Need to report in." Nora gave a practical shrug. "Tell them it's still breathing." Evelyn smiled at him, her hand resting briefly at his elbow, light, unassuming. "If you ever want a meal that isn't from a tin, you know where the coffee is warm." He nodded again, faintly unsettled by how easily the offer slipped through his defenses. The drive home was quiet. Dusk settled over Cedar Hollow without ceremony. Daniel fed Duke and warmed soup on the stove, listening to the familiar sounds of his small house, the tick of cooling metal, the distant murmur of traffic, the dog's steady breathing. Later, when he stepped out with Duke into the cold night, the town lay hushed. Duke stopped at the edge of the porch and did not look toward the street or the trees. Instead, he turned his head toward the bend of the road that led down to the river. In the house that stood waiting there, a low sound formed in his chest. Soft, restrained, uneasy. Daniel followed the dog's gaze into the darkness and felt a quiet, persistent sense that something unfinished had shifted. Just enough to remind him it was still there. Rain had been falling since early afternoon, not in heavy sheets, but in a steady, patient drizzle that softened the edges of the world. By the time Daniel guided his truck back down the narrow road toward the river, the sky hung low and gray, and the trees along the bank blurred into dark watercolor shapes. The wipers moved in a slow, familiar rhythm. Duke sat upright in the passenger seat, eyes fixed forward, his body quiet in a way that told Daniel the dog felt the shift in the air just as clearly as he did. This wasn't the kind of weather that made people uneasy. It was the kind that made them listen. Daniel parked at the foot of the drive and stepped out into the damp chill, the smell of wet leaves and cold water rising from the ground. As he unlocked the door and entered the house again, the stillness inside felt different from the last time. Not heavier exactly, but closer, as though the walls had drawn in around what they held. He set his clipboard on the small table and began the slow, methodical work the bank had asked of him. Inventory. Chairs, chipped but sturdy. A narrow bookshelf, half filled. A sideboard along the wall with its drawers still lined in paper yellowed by time. He wrote each item down with the same careful attention he gave to everything. Not because the objects themselves mattered, but because the record of them did. Duke moved in quiet parallel, his nails ticking softly against the floor as he crossed from room to room, nose tracing familiar paths of old scent. Cold ash, river mud, dry wood, the faint ghost of something floral long gone. The rain tapped against the windows in a fine, endless whisper. Daniel had nearly finished the front room when Duke stopped. Not slowly this time, not in his usual measured way, but all at once, his body stiffening as if a wire had been pulled tight beneath the fur. He stood near the corner by the old stone fireplace, head low, ears angled forward. Then his paw scraped once against the floor. The sound was sharp in the quiet. Daniel looked up at once. "What is it?" he asked softly. Duke scraped again, more insistently now, a steady rhythm against the warped floorboards. The sound raised something in Daniel's chest, a familiar, uneasy alertness that came from long habit rather than fear. He set the clipboard aside and crouched beside the dog. The boards beneath Duke's paw were darker than the rest, their grain slightly misaligned, as if they'd been disturbed long ago and set back in a hurry. Daniel pressed his knuckles against the wood and tapped. The sound that came back was not solid. It held the faint hollowness of empty space. Duke let out a low, steady breath. Not a growl, but something close to it. Daniel fetched a small pry bar from his bag, the movement calm but precise. The first board came up with a tired squeal of old nails surrendering. Beneath it lay a narrow cavity framed by joists darkened with age. Inside, tucked neatly against the earth beneath the house, sat a small metal box, its surface dulled with rust, but its edges still straight. Daniel eased it out with both hands, feeling its unexpectedly solid weight. Duke sat back on his haunches and watched without blinking. The box opened with a reluctant groan. Inside were several thin ledgers bound with fraying string, a handful of envelopes thick with paper rather than letters alone, and, folded once with deliberate care, a single sheet addressed in careful handwriting. To the one who knows how to listen to the truth. Daniel's breath caught slightly as he lifted the letter free. He did not sit at once. He simply stood there in the dim light, rain ticking at the windows, Duke's steady presence warm at his side, and read. Clara's words were plain and unembellished, written not with panic, but with resolve. She wrote of the flood and the chaos that had followed, of families turned suddenly uncertain, of relief money raised in hope and then quietly redirected. She named the men who had sat on the committee, the firm signatures they used beneath official language that hid what it did not excuse. At the center of it all, she wrote, was the man who had been the mayor's father, the one the town still spoke of with careful respect. The money, she explained, had not vanished. She had moved it, slowly, quietly, out of reach, not for herself, but to keep it from becoming a weapon against those who had already lost enough. They were using relief to buy silence and land, she wrote. They called it business. I call it theft with a better suit. Daniel read on, his hand tightening around the page. Clara had known the cost. She wrote that she had understood, even before the rumors began, what would happen once she refused to return the money to men who believed power was proof of right. Someone has to carry the blame so the others may keep their hands clean, she had written. If it must be me, then I will be the one. There was no plea in her words, no bitterness, only the quiet insistence that the truth did not belong to those who shouted the loudest. When Daniel finally lowered the letter, the rain had softened to a distant hush. Duke had moved closer without him noticing, his shoulder pressed into Daniel's leg, steady and sure. Daniel closed his eyes for a long moment, not to escape the weight of what he had read, but to let it settle fully. He sat down at last on the edge of the old rug and opened one of the ledgers. The numbers inside marched steadily down the page. Dates, amounts, careful lines of ink that told a story as clearly as words ever could. Funds withdrawn in increments too measured to be panic. Deposits made under names that did not match the committee's official accounts. Notes in the margins that spoke not of greed, but of direction. Held here. Moved again for safety. Do not return yet. The envelopes held cash, brittle with age, and photocopies of bank statements yellowed toward brown. Clara had not taken the money and hidden it for comfort. She had tended it the way some people tend a wound, cleaning it, binding it, waiting for the right moment that never seemed to come. Daniel felt a stirring behind his ribs that surprised him with its quiet intensity. This was not anger. Not yet. It was something slower, heavier. Recognition. Duke shifted beside him and rested his chin briefly against Daniel's knee, as if acknowledging a change that did not need words. When Daniel finally gathered the contents and placed them back into the box, his hands moved with reverence rather than hurry. He slid the floorboard into place, leaving only the faintest sign of disturbance that only he and Duke would notice. By the time Daniel stepped back out into the rain, the light had thinned to a dim silver wash. He locked the door again, his motion slower than before, as though he were sealing something sacred rather than simply securing property. The drive back felt longer, each curve of the road carrying the echo of Clara's words in his mind. The town lights appeared one by one through the trees, small beacons against the dark. When he pulled into his own driveway, night had fully settled. Inside, the house greeted him with familiar, homely sounds. The gentle click of the heater, the soft thud of Duke's paws on the kitchen floor. Daniel fed the dog and set water to heat for himself. But his appetite had gone quiet. He sat at the table with the unopened ledger before him, not touching it, simply letting his fingers rest on the worn wood. The letter lay folded in his jacket pocket, its presence heavier than the box had ever been. Outside, rain tapped steadily against the glass, no longer whispering now, but speaking plainly. Duke approached and sat at Daniel's feet, close enough that their warmth overlapped. Daniel looked down at him and spoke at last, his voice low and uncertain. "You found it," he said. Duke's tail moved once against the floor. Daniel let out a slow breath. He did not yet know what he was going to do with what they had uncovered. But he understood one thing with a clarity that surprised him. From this moment on, he was no longer just a man hired to look after an empty house. And the secret Clara had carried alone for so long was no longer hers to bear. The rain deepened around them, and with it the quiet sense that listening was only the beginning. Sleep did not come easily that night. Daniel lay on his narrow bed with the open ledger and Clara's letter resting on the small table beside him, the words echoing in his mind long after he had folded the pages shut. Duke had taken his usual place on the floor near the door, his breathing slow and even, one ear angled toward the window that looked out onto the street. The rain that had followed them home from the river had thinned to a mist, tapping lightly against the glass like hesitant fingers. Daniel closed his eyes at last, not into deep rest, but into that shallow half-sleep he had known too well for most of his adult life. He did not know how long he had been drifting when Duke's low growl cut through the quiet. It was not the soft, questioning sound the dog sometimes made in his dreams. This was sharp and urgent, a warning pulled tight from deep in his chest. Daniel's eyes snapped open. Duke was on his feet in an instant, muscles rigid, head turned toward the side window. The growl deepened as the sound of hurried footsteps scraped against gravel outside, followed by the distant cough of an engine turning over too fast. Headlights swept briefly across the far wall in a startled flash of white, then vanished down the dirt road toward the river. Daniel was out of bed before the echo of the engine faded, his heart hammering not with panic, but with a bleak, steady certainty. By the time he reached the window, the road lay empty again, pale in the fog, as if nothing had passed along it at all. Duke stood pressed against his leg, still watching the darkness, his breath slow but controlled. Daniel rested a hand on the dog's shoulder and waited with him until the night settled back into uneasy stillness. Morning brought a thin, washed-out light and the sharp smell of wet earth. Daniel did not linger over breakfast. He dressed, checked that the ledgers and letter were secured, and followed the road back down toward the river, with Duke riding alert beside him. The house by the water looked unchanged at a glance, quiet and closed in on itself the way it always had, but as Daniel drew closer, the first wrong note sang out immediately. The lock on the front door hung crooked, its metal housing twisted and scarred. He knelt to inspect it, jaw tightening as he traced the fresh scrape marks in the wood. Inside, the front room bore the subtle chaos of intrusion. Drawers stood open where he had left them shut. The small sideboard near the wall had been forced halfway from its place. Papers lay scattered across the table in a careless fan, as though someone had searched quickly and with rising anger. Duke moved through the house with silent urgency, checking each room in turn. Nothing else appeared to be missing. But on the floor near the fireplace, weighed down by a small stone, lay a single strip of paper. Daniel picked it up slowly. The words were printed in blunt, uneven letters, as if pressed with deliberate force. Don't dig into the past if you want to stay safe in Cedar Hollow. Daniel stood very still with the note in his hand. The threat itself did not surprise him. What unsettled him was the restraint of it. No name, no flourish, just a simple declaration of reach. Duke returned to his side and lifted his head to look at him, eyes searching. Daniel folded the paper once and slipped it into his pocket. The diner was nearly empty when Daniel arrived later that morning. Only 2 booths were occupied, and an elderly couple sat near the window sharing coffee without speaking. Evelyn was behind the counter with her sleeves rolled up, her movements steady but distracted. Nora occupied her usual stool at the far end, a grocery list folded neatly beside her hand. Both women looked up at once when Daniel and Duke entered. One glance at his face was enough to change the air between them. Daniel took the booth nearest the counter, and Duke settled at his feet without being told. Evelyn poured 3 cups of coffee and joined them, sliding one toward Daniel with quiet care. Nora leaned closer, her practical eyes narrowing. "You look like you didn't sleep," she said. Daniel hesitated only a second before placing the folded note on the table between them. Evelyn lifted it first, her brows knitting as she read. Nora's lips pressed into a thin line when it reached her. "They broke into Clara's house," Daniel said quietly. "Searched for something. They didn't find what they wanted." Silence stretched across the small booth. The coffee steamed, untouched. Evelyn set the note down at last and rested her hand against the warm mug as if drawing strength from the simple heat. "Clara didn't have anyone to stand between her and this kind of fear," she said softly. "Not when it mattered most." Her eyes lifted to Daniel's. "Now at least she's not alone in this, even if she's gone." Nora studied Daniel's face with new calculation. "You could still walk away," she said, not unkindly. "People do it every day." Daniel's hand moved without thought to the watch at his wrist, his thumb rubbing the worn edge of its face. "I know," he replied. "But some things don't let you walk past them once they've spoken." Evelyn's mouth curved into a faint, sad smile. "Then you'd better not walk alone." It was early afternoon when Daniel reached the county nursing home. The building sat low among bare trees at the edge of town, its brick walls washed pale by years of weather. Inside, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and boiled vegetables. A nurse at the front desk directed him down a quiet hallway to the small common room where Walter Briggs spent most of his days. Walter sat near the window in a wheelchair, his thin frame wrapped in a blanket that dwarfed him, hands resting loosely in his lap. His hair was sparse and white, his face mapped deeply with lines that spoke not of one hard life, but many. When Daniel introduced himself, Walter's pale eyes sharpened with a flicker of something that might once have been authority. "You're the one poking around Clara Moore's place," he said without preamble. Daniel did not deny it. He pulled a chair close and sat at eye level, keeping his voice even. "I found her records." Walter's gaze drifted toward the window as if watching a different season pass by. "She kept better books than any of us," he murmured. "Too honest for her own safety." After a long moment, he turned back. "We all saw it. The way the money moved. Quiet at first, then faster once they knew no one would stop them." His fingers tightened slightly against the blanket. "We told ourselves it was complicated, that it was for rebuilding. We told ourselves a lot of things that made it easier to sleep." Daniel listened without interrupting. "I was on the committee," Walter continued. "Not at the top, but high enough to know better. When Clara raised her questions, they offered her a share to calm her down. She refused. That's when they decided she'd be the story everyone remembered, instead of them." His voice thinned with effort. "I stayed quiet. So did most of us. Fear ages slower than men do." Daniel felt the weight of the old man's words settle heavily between them. "Why tell me now?" he asked. Walter gave a frail, crooked smile. "Because you're listening. And because I'm running out of time to be anything but what I am." Duke lay quietly at Daniel's feet throughout the exchange, his presence steady and unwavering. When Daniel rose to leave, Walter reached out with trembling fingers and caught his sleeve. "If you do something with this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "do it knowing you'll wake a lot of ghosts." Daniel met his gaze and nodded. "I already have." Outside, the light had shifted toward evening again, the sky bruised with the promise of colder rain. Daniel walked slowly back to his truck with Duke close at his side, the dog's shoulder brushing his knee with each step as if to keep him anchored. The road ahead looked no different than it had that morning, and yet everything about it felt changed. Not in shape, but in weight. The threat folded in his pocket, Clara's letter waiting at home, Walter's confession echoing through his thoughts, all pressed together in a quiet, relentless question. By the time they reached the edge of Cedar Hollow and the mountains rose dark against the sky, Daniel understood with unsettling clarity that the hardest part was no longer what he had found. It was deciding whether he would live as another keeper of silence, or as the man who finally chose to speak. The change in Cedar Hollow did not arrive with noise. It came the way cold seeps through the boards of a house long before winter is announced. At first, Daniel only felt it in small hesitations. How the waitress paused before refilling his coffee. How a conversation softened mid-sentence when he stepped into the diner. By the third day, the silence became its own language. The owner of the general store called him into the back room and spoke with careful politeness, eyes fixed on a dusty shelf instead of Daniel's face. The store no longer needed daytime security. Business was tight. Daniel nodded, thanked him, and walked out with the last of his pay folded into the inside pocket of his red and black jacket. Duke waited at the door, tail still, ears alert, as if he already sensed what had shifted. By evening, the bank followed. A clipped voice on the phone informed Daniel that Clara Moore's property would soon be placed into public auction. For everyone's peace of mind, the clerk added, meaning for yours most of all. Daniel listened without interruption. When the call ended, he stood in the quiet of his cabin kitchen with the receiver still in his hand, feeling the old familiar pressure in his chest, the kind that came not from fear alone, but from the slow realization that events were being guided beyond his reach. Outside, Duke sat on the porch step, head lifted, gaze fixed down the road. The black sedan arrived just after sunset. Its engine purred too smoothly for the gravel drive, the headlights pausing as if to announce their presence before dimming. Daniel did not move at first. He set his coffee down, pulled on his boots, and stepped outside. Victor Lane stood beside the car, immaculate in a charcoal suit that did not belong to dirt roads or mountain dusk. He was in his mid-30s at most, lean, clean-shaven, with hair dark and precise, as if cut by a ruler. His smile came easily, but did not reach his eyes. "Mr. Harris," he said with the gentle confidence of a man accustomed to being received, "I hoped we might speak." Duke stepped forward without sound, placing his body half a step ahead of Daniel's shin, not growling, not baring teeth, only watching. Victor nodded mildly, but did not retreat. He spoke instead of reputations, of how delicate a town's balance could be, of how unnecessary conflict disturbed everyone involved. He reminded Daniel of his service record with polite admiration, called him a credit to Cedar Hollow. And then, just as calmly, he warned him not to become a disruption. "This town doesn't need another hero," Victor said softly. Daniel rested his hand on Duke's head and felt the dog lean subtly back into his touch. "I'll think about what you said," Daniel replied. It was not agreement, nor was it defiance. It was simply the truth. Victor smiled, as if that were enough. When the sedan pulled away, dust drifted across the road like thin smoke. The old dreams returned that night. Daniel could feel the floor beneath him shaking again, hear the roar that never completely faded, even after decades. He woke drenched in sweat, breath locked in his chest, hand clutching for a rifle that was no longer there. Duke climbed onto the bed without being called, placing his weight across Daniel's legs and lower chest, steady and warm. The dog's breath slowed first, then Daniel's followed. By morning, exhaustion pressed behind his eyes like bruises. He moved through the day on habit alone, feeding Duke, splitting wood, checking the tools in his box as if he still had a job to report to. The rhythm helped, but it did not quiet the question that had begun circling in his mind. How long could he pretend that what he had found under Clara's floor could remain buried with her? Near noon, Nora arrived at his door. Her hair, usually pinned neatly, was loose around her temples, her hands trembling as she held out a folded letter from the bank. The loan on her shop had been declared irregular. Payment was now due in full. Daniel read the figures once, then again. It was impossible. He looked up to find her eyes fixed on the floor between their feet. "They told me it was only business," she said. The words tasted bitter in her mouth. It was then that the truth became unavoidable. Whatever power had once twisted Clara's life had never truly gone dormant. It had only learned to wait. Preparations for the flood memorial moved quickly after that. Banners appeared on lampposts. Folding chairs lined the hall by the river. Programs were printed and quietly distributed through the town. Daniel saw them tacked to the bulletin board outside the post office. 50 years of remembrance, 40 years of prosperity. Zero mention of the woman whose name still seemed to tug at the ground itself. That evening, he walked alone with Duke toward the hall as the sky thinned into violet and the river's surface caught the last light like a scar. The doors were locked, the building dark, but the smell of old wood and water lingered in the stones. He stood there longer than he meant to, one hand resting on the weathered planks, feeling the shallow vibrations of passing cars through the grain. Duke sat at his heel, posture calm but alert, eyes tracking every movement along the road. Daniel wondered when, exactly, he had stopped expecting anyone to stand beside him when the quiet turned dangerous. He realized, with a tenderness that surprised him, that the answer now sat on 4 legs at his side. The pressure increased in smaller ways after that. Requests that were thinly veiled warnings, glances that lingered too long, conversations that ended when he drew near. The memory of the war crept closer in response. He began waking earlier, patrolling the yard without meaning to, listening for sounds that did not belong. He told himself this was foolishness, that Cedar Hollow was not a battlefield. But his hands still remembered how to check the perimeter, and Duke never questioned the routine. One evening, as they returned from a long walk by the outer ridge, Daniel noticed a faint scratch along the edge of his cabin door, shallow but deliberate, as if someone had tested the lock. He knelt to inspect it while Duke's low, steady growl settled into the back of his throat. Nothing else followed. No confrontation. Only the message that someone had been close enough to leave a mark and walk away unseen. The night before the memorial rehearsal, Daniel sat at his kitchen table with the documents spread before him. Clara's letter lay on top, its paper soft with age, its words heavier now than when he first read them. Duke lay beside the chair with his head resting on Daniel's boot, eyes half closed, but not asleep. Daniel traced the edge of the page with one finger, thinking of all the ways this could end badly. Nora's shop shuttered, his cabin vandalized, his own name bent into something crooked. Peace was still possible. All he had to do was close the folder, return the papers to their hiding place, and resume the life he had built out of manageable days and quiet nights. The life where he fixed fences and doors for people who barely looked past his jacket and the dog at his side. It was not a noble life. It was not even a particularly brave one. But it had been his, and it had been survivable. Outside, the wind lifted through the trees, brushing the eaves with a soft, wandering sound. Duke shifted and placed one paw against Daniel's foot, a small, unconscious gesture of contact. Daniel thought of the way the dog always stepped between him and what felt wrong. Not because he understood corruption or history, but because he understood threat, understood fear, understood the difference between silence that was safe and silence that was waiting to break. Clara had not had a Duke. Nora had no one between her and the men who signed papers that could erase her livelihood. And Daniel, for all his weariness, was still alive, still able to choose. He gathered the documents into their folder, not returning them to the floor beneath his cabin, but tucking them instead into his worn canvas pack. When he looked down, Duke lifted his head and met his eyes, steady and unblinking. Daniel swallowed once, the decision taking shape in the quiet between them. The peace he could keep was no longer the peace he could live with. And somewhere beyond the river, beyond the banners and rehearsed speeches and carefully edited histories, the truth waited its turn to breathe. The hall was full long before the mayor took the stage. Folding chairs scraped against the wooden floor as people shifted into place, the low sound of murmurs weaving together like distant water over stone. Black and white photographs lined the walls, faces half erased by time. Children standing barefoot in mud, men with sleeves rolled up beside collapsed homes. Daniel stood near the double doors at the back, his shoulders slightly hunched as if to make himself smaller, though he felt anything but small inside. The canvas bag hung heavy against his hip, the folder inside it pressing insistently against his side. Duke sat close to his leg, body upright and still, ears turning lazily toward each new sound. When Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, he could feel the dog's warmth through his pants, steady and grounding, a reminder that he was not facing this alone. At the front of the hall, Mayor Lane waited beside the podium, both hands resting on the polished wood as if it were a familiar anchor. Time had softened his once broad frame into something narrower, his hair thinned to silver. But power moved through him with the same practiced ease. A few steps behind him stood Victor, immaculate as always, dark suit unwrinkled, posture relaxed in the way of men who believe the world is arranged to bend around them. When the mayor leaned toward the microphone, the room slowly stilled. He spoke of resilience. He spoke of unity. He spoke of how Cedar Hollow had pulled itself from the river's grasp half a century ago and never looked back. Heads nodded, some in agreement, some in resignation. A few people studied the floor, their hands folded in their laps as if they were listening out of duty rather than belief. Daniel felt his heartbeat gather behind his ribs. As the speech continued, the words began to blur together. Strength, growth, sacrifice, community. He hardly heard them as phrases anymore, only as sounds that filled the space and pushed toward an ending he knew was coming. When the mayor's voice dipped toward that familiar closing tone, the one that always signaled a clean ending and a comfortable silence, Daniel stood. The movement was quiet at first, just the scrape of his chair against wood. A few people turned. Someone in the front row glanced back, eyebrows lifting in faint surprise. Duke rose smoothly beside him, stepping forward half a pace, his body aligned with Daniel's leg as if they had practiced the motion together. "My name is Daniel Harris," Daniel said. His voice sounded steadier than his hands felt. The microphone caught the words and carried them forward before the mayor or anyone else could interrupt. Daniel swallowed once and continued. "I was hired to watch over Clara Moore's house. I found things there that don't belong to the story we've been telling for 50 years. A ripple moved through the room, small and uncertain. Victor's head snapped toward Daniel. The mayor froze behind the podium, mouth half open. Daniel drew the folder from his bag with a slow, deliberate motion. He felt the room leaning toward him, not with their bodies, but with their attention, the shared breath of dozens of people waiting to see whether he would falter. Clara Moore was not a thief, Daniel said, his gaze lifting from the papers to the faces ahead of him. She was the one who tried to keep the relief money from disappearing completely. A woman near the front whispered something Daniel could not hear. A man 2 rows behind her shook his head faintly, as if arguing with himself. Daniel opened the first page and held it up where the nearest eyes could see the inked columns of numbers. He spoke of accounts moved under unfamiliar names, of funds marked for administrative costs that never lined up with actual work. He spoke of companies that existed only on paper and addresses that led nowhere but empty offices. As he spoke, his voice grew steadier, not louder, but more certain, each sentence landing with the quiet weight of something that had waited too long to be heard. Then he unfolded Clara's letter. He read only a few lines aloud, enough to carry her voice into the hall, enough for the word fear and the phrase, "I could not let them take it all," to settle into the air between chairs. Daniel felt his throat tighten as he spoke her words, but he did not stop. When he finished, the room was silent in a way it had not been before. Not the polite stillness of a ceremony, but the brittle hush of a truth being tested. It was Victor who broke that silence first. "That's enough," Victor said sharply, already moving down the aisle. His face was tight, his jaw clenched in an attempt to keep control where it was slipping. "You're turning a memorial into a circus." He reached for the folder in Daniel's hands. The sound that rose in Duke's chest came without command. It was low and resonant, filling the hall with a warning that did not need translation. The dog stepped forward in one fluid motion, placing his body squarely between Victor and Daniel, his stance wide and unyielding. The growl deepened, vibrating through the wooden floor, through the legs of the chairs, through Victor's bones as he stumbled back half a step in startled retreat. For a moment, no one breathed. Then a sharp click cut through the stillness. A young man near the side aisle had raised a small recorder. Another click followed as he lifted a camera, hands shaking slightly but determined. His dark curls fell into his eyes, and Daniel guessed he could not have been more than 25. The boy swallowed once, then steadied his grip and kept recording. The mayor's voice wavered when he tried to speak. "This is highly inappropriate," he began, but the authority was gone from the words before they reached the back row. From the second row, an elderly man's voice cracked the air. "I knew someone who sold his land for half of what it was worth," he said, slowly. "Right after the flood. Said he had no choice." Another voice followed. "The Lane Construction Company rebuilt half the valley in less than a year." A woman stood with the help of her cane. "My brother worked for one of those companies," she said. "He said the books were never clean." The murmurs grew into overlapping sentences, half-formed confessions, remembered suspicions, given shape at last. Daniel felt the weight of the hall shift as if a wall had moved inside it. Victor stood rigid at the aisle's center, eyes darting from face to face. The mayor's hands trembled where they rested on the podium. Daniel lowered the papers. His hands shook now, no longer from fear, but from release. 50 years of silence pressed back against the tide of voices and finally broke. He felt Duke ease his stance slightly, the growl fading but the presence remaining, solid and protective at his side. When the noise swelled into something louder and less controlled, Daniel stepped back. He did not wait for questions. He turned and began walking toward the doors. Duke moved with him at once, staying close without crowding, his shoulder brushing Daniel's leg as they passed rows of faces turned inward on themselves. Outside, the cool evening air struck Daniel's skin like water. He took one breath, then another, the noise of the hall muffled behind thick wooden doors that now seemed fragile. The banners fluttered overhead, their cheerful words no longer fitting the air beneath them. Daniel descended the steps slowly, Duke beside him, until the sounds of the river returned, steady and indifferent. He stopped at the edge of the lot and looked up at the darkened sky. For a long moment, he said nothing. The weight that had lived in him since the night he opened Clara's hiding place was still there. But it had changed. It was no longer a secret pressing inward. It was something that had been let loose into the world, something that could not be called back. Duke leaned against his leg with slow, familiar pressure. Daniel rested his hand on the dog's head and stared into the road that led back toward his cabin, toward Nora's shop, toward the town that would never quite be the same after tonight. And he wondered silently whether the truth, once spoken, would truly be enough to protect the ones who had finally dared to let it live. The weeks that followed unfolded not with thunder, but with paperwork, quiet phone calls, and the slow turning of an old system that had finally been forced to move. An official investigation was opened. Accounts once shielded by reputation were frozen. Documents were reviewed line by line. The name Lane appeared again and again across years of transactions where it did not belong. Daniel did not attend any of the early hearings. He followed the news only through the local paper, which Duke carried each morning from the edge of the porch in his careful jaws, the pages faintly crumpled from the weight of the dew. When the notice appeared confirming that several unfair property seizures were under review, including Nora's shop, Daniel folded the paper with hands that trembled only slightly and left it on the kitchen table like something fragile that had only just returned from the dead. Nora's laughter came a few days later, bright and almost disbelieving, when the bank formally reversed its decision. Her shop would remain hers. The loan would be restructured under new supervision. She cried openly in the middle of the street while Daniel stood awkwardly beside her, unsure where to place his hands, Duke leaning forward to rest his warm head against her thigh, as if to absorb some of the shock that her small body could not yet contain. Cedar Hollow did not transform overnight, but the shape of it began to loosen. People looked one another in the eye more often. Long muted stories gained voices, and in the midst of it all, the town council, now conspicuously absent of Lane influence, announced that the River House would not be sold. Clara Moore's home was to be restored. Work began quietly at first. The sagging porch was braced and straightened. Windows clouded by decades of dust were opened and washed until the river once again reflected itself in their glass. The warped floors were sanded smooth enough for careful feet, though some of the old creaks remained as if the house itself wished to be remembered, even in its healing. When the council asked Daniel to oversee the work and later to remain on as caretaker and instructor, he accepted with hesitation that surprised even him. He had never seen himself as a man who guided others, only as one who fixed what was broken when it lay plainly in front of him. But now the broken thing was not wood or iron. It was a town. The Clara Moore Learning Center opened in early autumn. Children arrived first, tentative and curious, their voices echoing too loudly in rooms still accustomed to silence. Daniel taught them simple tasks at the long work table beneath the front windows. How to hinge a door, how to sharpen a blade with care rather than force, how to read the grain of wood before cutting it. The older residents came in slow waves. He showed them how to adjust the brightness on borrowed tablets so they could see the faces of distant grandchildren, how to steady a trembling finger long enough to press a button that connected them across states and years. Duke lay at the center of the main room most days, a constant island of fur and calm. Children draped their arms around his broad neck and whispered secrets into his ears. Elderly hands brushed his back with an intimacy usually reserved for family. In the afternoons, Evelyn arrived with baskets of bread, her gray curls tucked into a soft scarf, her laugh carrying easily through the open doors. She moved through the center with quiet familiarity, refilling cups and straightening chairs without being asked. Occasionally, she and Daniel walked together along the riverbank, while Duke trotted ahead, alert but unhurried. Their conversations were not confessions or promises. They were exchanges of weather, of shared silences, of small observations that revealed more than dramatic declarations ever could. When her hand slipped into the crook of his arm, Daniel felt no need to question it. It was enough. One evening, after the last child had been collected and the final cup washed, Daniel stood alone in the main room, beneath the framed photograph of Clara Moore, smiling beside a worn blackboard. The sound of the river drifted in through open windows. Duke sat at his heel. Daniel lifted his hand and rested his palm lightly against the glass that shielded her image. He did not speak, but the words moved anyway through his chest like a tide. You are no longer alone in what you carried. The air in the room felt warmer for it, though the night beyond the windows was already settling into the chill of approaching winter. Daniel's life did not become loud with triumph. It became steady with purpose. He woke early, unlocked the doors, and swept the floors that once held only dust and regret. He returned home in the evenings with sawdust in his hair and the faint ache of honest work in his shoulders. He slept more deeply, the old dreams losing their edge as Duke's breathing at his bedside stitched him to the present. Willow Ridge did not speak his name with awe. It spoke it with trust. And that, Daniel found, weighed differently upon a man's soul. On a late afternoon edged with gold, Daniel, Duke, and Evelyn sat together on the wide porch, watching the children chase one another along the river's bend. No one mentioned the Lane family anymore. Their absence had become a quiet fact rather than a looming shadow. Evelyn leaned her head gently against Daniel's shoulder. Duke's tail swept slow arcs against the wooden boards. The river moved on, as it always had. The house stood where pain once gathered and now loosened its grip. And, in the space between memory and mourning, Daniel Harris finally understood that legacy was not what a man left behind in stone or scandal, but what he chose, every day, to build with his hands when the truth had already set him free. Sometimes, the miracle we're waiting for doesn't come as thunder from the sky. Sometimes, it comes quietly, in the form of a loyal dog, a tired old heart that refuses to turn away, and the simple courage to tell the truth. Clara waited half a lifetime for her name to be cleared. Daniel never set out to be a hero. Yet somehow, God used both of them, one in silence, one in action, to restore what was lost. Maybe that is how grace truly works. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady, patient, and faithful. A quiet hand guiding us through ordinary days until the right moment arrives. If this story touched your heart, perhaps it's because there is a truth in your own life still waiting to be spoken. A wound still waiting to be healed, or a small act of kindness waiting to become your miracle. If you believe that God can still work through broken people and forgotten places, please share this story with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what this story meant to you. And don't forget to subscribe so we can continue sharing stories of faith, courage, and quiet miracles together. May God bless you, protect your family, and bring peace into your home. And may you never forget, even in the quietest moments of life, you are never walking alone.